Hello and welcome to this first session of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Ghassan Morzin and I'm an assistant professor here at the Institute. So for our first session of this semester, we're very happy to welcome to the webinar Dr. Adam Frost. Dr. Frost is a Marie Sklodowska Career Actions Postdoctoral Fellow at Copenhagen Business School in the Department of Business Humanities and Law there. And his research is quite broad, but in general, looking at the Maoist period and entrepreneurship and business during this particular period. He's a prize-winning author, so his dissertation was awarded both the Cruz Prize of the Business History Conference and the dissertation prize of the International Convention of Asia Scholars. And so we are particularly lucky to have him here today. And I think he will be talking to us today about some of his current research. So that sounds very exciting. His talk is entitled Brokering Capitalism in Maoist China. Before I hand things over, just a brief reminder of how the format works. So Dr. Frost is going to talk for around half an hour, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. You can at any time submit your questions through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out during the Q&A period, and Dr. Frost can get back to you. But Adam, if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
Yeah, happy to. Okay, let me share the screen here. Good, you should be able to see it now. And then I enabled subtitles for those of you that will help. Yeah, so my name's Adam, as Gassan mentioned, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a kind of ongoing project I have. It's sort of a book chapter for a larger book project that I'm currently working on. So it's a new project situated within a very much long-term project. So let's see, just as a way of very brief introduction, here's like kind of a slide that encapsulates my life journey in 3 quick images. And this is also sort of kind of a backstory for this research. So I grew up on a cattle ranch in rural Oklahoma. And in a family where no one had ever attended college. But I was lucky enough to get into Harvard University, and that really kind of opened up my universe. And there I became deeply interested in Chinese history, and philosophy and culture. And I started traveling to China every year and engaging with China deeply over the next 15 years. While I was in China, I would often travel to some of the poorest and remotest regions. So this was in Minxian County, Minxian in Gansu province. And this was in the wake of a big earthquake. And there I saw that even in the kind of poorest communities that faced a lot of kind of systemic challenges and where there was a lot of local corruption and things, villagers came together in the wake of disasters. They organized themselves to help each other and to rebuild their homes and their lives. And so in these places that I traveled to, I began documenting how, despite incomplete markets and institutional barriers to mobility and employment, people creatively engaged in informal organizing and informal economic activities to survive. For example, this family right here that I took a picture of, they engaged in begging after their home was knocked down. They took out a big loan from a loan shark to rebuild. They couldn't get it finished though. They ran out of money and they had a high interest debt, so they began begging as a way of earning money. And they did. They earned enough money to pay off their loan here, and then they eventually actually invested in a tractor and started a small kind of agricultural business with that and rebuilt their lives. Okay, so why do I mention that? It's because these firsthand experiences with informal organizing and the informal economy began to deeply influence my research, shaping the kinds of questions that I ask and the approaches that I started adopting to answer them. So this talk is about, Maoist China in particular. My research it's kind of all over the place. It spans from the late Qing dynasty to the contemporary platform economy. But today I'll be focusing specifically on the 1960s and 70s. And of course, as I'm sure everyone knows, this is an era marked by intense state control, including formal rationing, price controls, and restrictions on movement and employment. Yet, amidst all of these constraints, a robust shadow economy thrived. As I began to find out from reading documents in this period, such as this one, there was all kinds of reports that rural markets had been transformed into hotbeds of capitalism and speculative activity already by the 1960s and 70s. As this report read, our region's rural markets have been transformed into hotbeds of capitalism. Droves of people participate in market exchange every day, wasting untold labor power. They freely transact controlled goods such as grain, cotton, and cooking oil in huge quantities. They even trade bicycles, sewing machines, and other manufactured products. And this the kind of closing remark. It is obvious that these are not proper socialist markets, but capitalist free markets. So my work seeks to answer a kind of fundamental question, namely, how do markets emerge and evolve, especially in environments where the state aims to control economic activity and everyday economic life? So in my book, I approach this question from different angles, exploring the role of so-called spontaneous forces, to underground enterprises, to local cadres and other actors, and how they each drove processes of market formation. But today I'm going to focus specifically on the role of informal intermediaries. And I asked, how did informal intermediaries contribute to processes of market formation during this period of Chinese history? So to address this question about the informal economy in Maoist China, I adopt a market-based approach. So over the course of 5 years of field work in China, I visited flea markets all across China and networked with and established relationships with document merchants. Over time, I was able to procure thousands and thousands of documents that were former local government archives that had been earmarked for destruction, but instead made it into private circulation. So these were deaccession documents. They're the stuff that local government institutions didn't care about. They weren't, in their view, worth saving for posterity. But I nonetheless find these documents really fascinating. So I got large collections of things like this, which included internal reports of the Gongshuan Xincheng Guanliju, the office, the state administration for industry and commerce. They also included thousands of case files of speculators and profiteers, 投机倒把案件. And I'm going to focus particularly on these case files because they form the basis for today's talk, and they really shape a lot of the kind of primary source that I use for a lot of the work I do in my book project. So case files are highly complex sources comprised of heterogeneous elements. They include written self-confessions of individuals accused of engaging in illicit activities. They have the transcripts of interrogations conducted by market administration officers, and they have the receipts of seizures for cash and goods uncovered in the course of investigations. And here I should emphasize how difficult these sources are to work with. I mean, these are, as you can see, mostly handwritten accounts. This one's actually relatively clear. A lot of these are extremely messy. They're mostly, they're written by a lot of cadres who are, during the 1950s and 60s, there was this massive uptake of cadres, right? They're rapidly expanding the state bureaucracy. And they're not necessarily recruiting the most capable people in the rural countryside in certain areas. So a lot of these documents are being produced by semi-literate people who made frequent orthographic errors and homophonic substitutions. And of course, they're also produced during a period when Mandarin itself is undergoing transition. We're moving into simplified script, and there's all kinds of regional idiosyncrasies and everything with how that's done. With how the characters are represented. So they're a very, very difficult to work with, as anyone who has knows. But what do the cases tell us about informal intermediaries and their role in reshaping the Maoist economy? Well, in the case files, we find an array of entrepreneurial actors engaged in various forms of informal intermediation. These included illicit procurement networks. So the procurement officers of state agencies, 采购人员, who were employed to purchase goods as material inputs for production processes. But there was also these illicit procurement networks. These people would often run side businesses by themselves and recirculate goods in the economy. There were underground guest houses that served as basically kind of an informal hotel network for people who were traveling, oftentimes in undocumented ways. They didn't have the necessary 介绍信, letters of introduction, and other kinds of materials that they needed, or nor did they probably have the necessary ration certificates and stuff they needed. And so these guest houses played a really critical role in facilitating an underground ecosystem. But today I'm going to focus just on the latter two for the sake of time. So ration certificate traders, people who bought and sold grain rations, oil rations, and the like, and labor brokers, people that actively recruited undocumented, mainly rural labor, and then contracted it out to urban and rural enterprises. So I'm gonna just go in to a bit more detail about the ration certificate traders and labor brokers and their roles in intermediation. So, ration certificates, like these shown, were the lifeblood of the planned economy, dictating who could buy essential goods like grain, cloth, and oil. So in the Maoist economy, ration certificates were non-monetary securities, 物价证券, that in principle possess no value and could not legally be bought, sold, or traded. Certificates represented entitlements to purchase a specified amount of a certain good at a state fixed price. So without ration certificates, you weren't entitled to purchase goods like grain, and without the cash, you couldn't exercise that entitlement. So you had to have both. But because the supply of essential goods like grain and oil and things was heavily controlled, and because the state list values were so much higher or so much lower than their black market prices, ration certificates themselves became objects of value and mediums of exchange. And in the hands of entrepreneurial intermediaries, they became something even more powerful, essentially a de facto currency, a currency substitute. So the cases talk about a lot of informal intermediaries, like this group of people here who was photographed, and they were ration certificate smugglers. They bought up large amounts of ration certificates and then smuggled them across administrative boundaries from places of lower to higher value. They helped transform ration certificates into a currency substitute, and they undermine the state's ability to control basic necessities. This was really important because, theoretically, if you couldn't get the ration certificates that you needed to subsist, you couldn't live in a place, which meant that people were essentially tied to their places of hukou registration, theoretically. The networks that emerged to facilitate this illicit trade were extremely complex, resilient, and remarkably effective in circumventing state control. I'm just showing this network here, and I'm going to break it down part by part to explain it. So let's go into each part of this in detail. So here's an image, of how ration certificates were supposed to circulate in theory. Basically households were assigned ration certificates by state agencies, and then they redeemed these in state-run shops. The state-run shops then reported the redemption patterns, and then this would basically facilitate the ability of the state to coordinate the allocation and distribution of goods in the economy. But what happened? But what happens when this economy was out of balance, when certain households didn't have the requisite as much certificates as they needed? So or an abundance. So for example, certain households might have a surplus of certificates. So if you were in a household where you had multiple able-bodied laborers and no children, you would actually have a superabundance of ration certificates, more than you needed to subsist. So people would often save these up, and then they would sell them in order to get cash and then buy other goods that they wanted, like popular consumer products. So households would save these and they would sell them to these local traders who would buy up ration certificates within a given locale, a neighborhood, or a small town, and then they would resell them to other houses who had a deficit. So, for example, my spouse, she's Chinese from Ningbo. So her family in Ningbo, they were taking care of their grandmother's sister's daughter, she was registered in Shanghai, but she was living with them in the countryside. So that meant that the family had a surplus of certificates in Shanghai, but they needed to get the local Ningbo certificates. So they would go to these like local traders to make that work. But what happens when the circulation, these kind of imbalances in the economy weren't localized? They weren't contained within a fixed small area, but rather they happened across regions. Well, that's when you had a second layer of kind of brokers that was necessary. So sometimes you would have entire regions where there was a surplus or deficit of certificates. For example, there was lots of small towns in Western China where you had a massive surplus of certificates because a large number of the laborers were illicitly working in other locales. So, for example, or even in the regions, for example, surrounding Shanghai, there were so many people that were engaged in underground illicit business in Shanghai that the surrounding regions might have surpluses of certificates, whereas Shanghai had a massive deficit. So that's where these kind of second layer of intermediaries came in, wholesale brokers. So they would identify places that had surpluses, identify places that have deficit, and then recirculate the certificates from places of lower to higher value to address these imbalances in the economy. Here, national level certificates were really, really important. So certificates came at different levels. Some of them were bound to particular local administrations. Other ones had larger specifications. So, for example, the state issued members of the military and government officials national level grain rations and things that could be redeemed anywhere within a specified period of time. So, what often happened was, for example, at the grain shops, the employees would collect these national level certificates whenever they came in and then swap them out with other kinds of certificates. So I interviewed some former grain shop employees who said this was like very lucrative for them. So whenever like military people came to visit or officials from other counties and stuff came to visit, they would always collect these and then resell them to wholesale brokers who would then redistribute them to other areas of the country. And then the wholesale brokers, once they accumulated enough of these, they would identify places where they were in high demand, and then they would sell them to either informal organizations, which included things like guest houses, underground factories, and labor contract teams, which I'll mention in a moment, or and whatever they had left over that they didn't sell to the organizations, they would sell to local traders who are often called runners, who would then go and sell them from household to household. So some of the cases actually give really interesting glimpses into how this worked in practice. This one case mentioned, it gave a testimony, written testimony of one of these runners. He said, I began trading certificates in April of 1970. At first, I couldn't earn any money, but then I connected with a broker by the name of Jin. I didn't have any capital at that time, so he kicked the ball to me, giving me 300 kilos worth of grain ration certificates. And kick the ball here means give on credit without paying cash up front. I took the certificates across the border and sold them to a group of friends. And by buying at 0.58 yuan per gene and selling at 0.6 yuan, I earned my first profit of 12 yuan. So this gives a kind of sense of like the microdynamics of how these informal intermediaries operated. Also, going beyond these kind of like idiosyncratic descriptions of formal brokering, I tried to get a sense of like how pervasive these activities are across China. So I've built up quite large data sets of thousands of these cases of speculation and profiteering, and about 23% of all cases involved this ration certificate trade. So a huge number, or 1/4 roughly. And some of the cases that involve ration certificate trading involved tens of thousands of RMB worth of certificates. So these could be massive, massive quantities. And just to give a sense of that, the average annual income for a worker during this period is about 100 RMB. So, many, many, many times the average annual income. And just to give an example of how extensive some of these networks were, there's one case in Zhejiang from 1968. It mentions a network of 60 smugglers who smuggled over 200,000 jin of ration certificates between Yiwu and Wenzhou. And again, this is that area. Yeah, Yiwu was a place where there was a lot of surplus because a lot of the people that were registered to Yiwu were actually working for illicit enterprises in places like Wenzhou. And Wenzhou had a massive deficit because you had this influx of undocumented laborers. And the ringleader of that, the wholesale broker who coordinated this whole network, over the course of 18 months, he personally accrued 23,000 RMB in profits. So these activities were, I mean, huge in terms of their scale, and they were massively, massively impactful on the economy. The structure of these networks provided them with several capabilities. They enabled these networks to engage in information brokerage. These multi-level hierarchical networks of ration brokers exploited information asymmetries. The local people, the local traders had deep knowledge of local circumstance. They understood which households needed certificates, which ones might have a surplus, and the wholesale brokers had a more general view of like regional dynamics across China, which places like Yiwu were running surpluses, and which places like Wenzhou were running deficits. And they ultimately facilitated the mass recirculation of certificates in the economy. The structure of the networks also was really great for risk diffusion. It distributed risk via decentralization. If people like the local runners got caught, well, for one, they didn't have much exposure because the people at the very bottom of the chain weren't holding that much certificates or that much capital. But the people at the top of the chain were kind of more protected. And if any part of it got cracked down on, the rest of the network would continue to function. They were highly adaptable. They continually changed their methods of smuggling, for example, in response to changing state pressures. So, for example, some smugglers specialized in hollowing out cabbages and shoving ration certificates inside. And there was also a massive number of women smugglers because they could get past the checkpoints, and oftentimes the only officers on duty were men, and they weren't allowed to physically search the women. And these networks were also very scalable. They could, these ration certificate traders opened up new branches in different towns and cities and then simply added in those networks to their pre-established network. Okay, I'm going a little bit, so let me move a little bit faster really quick. But let me introduce really quickly dark contractors, Heibaotao. So these individuals recruited teams of undocumented rural workers and contracted the labor both to state-owned enterprises and underground factories. They, in essence, created an informal labor market by passing the state's rigid job allocation system. The demand for labor, especially in industries like construction and manufacturing, was so high that these contractors could negotiate lucrative deals. And sometimes even for infrastructural development and the like. So officially, construction work, like other forms of labor, was supposed to be organized through state-run and collective enterprises. Workers were assigned job, on the basis of the plan, not market mechanisms. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. So the state-run construction companies were often inefficient, and they lacked the capacity to meet the growing demand for new housing, factories, and infrastructure. Um, so this created a significant gap between the demand for construction labor and its officially sanctioned supply. And this is where these dark contractors stepped in. So these dark contractors, known as Hebauto, they were individuals, often with some prior experience in construction or manufacturing, who had the skills and the connections to assemble and manage a team of workers. They were the entrepreneurs in this underground labor market who identified opportunities, negotiated contracts, and oversaw the work. Sometimes they directly recruited laborers from the countryside and then paid them wages. At other times, they worked through intermediaries like the brigade leaders. So, for example, like dark contractors would work with the brigade leader and hire entire production teams. And then they would give the brigade commissions based on the aggregate wages of the hired laborers. Um, and then they would contract out that labor to enterprises. So here's enterprise managers. They're the demand side of the equation. And so the dark contractors would form contracts with enterprises and then supply them with the labor that they've recruited from the countryside. And then local officials were a critical part of this as well. So they often had to bribe local officials to get protection or to get the necessary kinds of documentation and seals of approval. To explain how this worked, let me briefly introduce one case of Mr. Xu, a black contractor who operated in Zhejiang during the 60s and 70s. So Mr. Xu was the son of a counter-revolutionary and a kind of unlikely candidate for success maybe in this informal economy, but he possessed a deep understanding of the local construction market and a remarkable ability to mobilize resources. Xu began by recruiting workers from his home village and surrounding areas, leveraging his existing social ties, kinship networks, village affiliations, and so on, to build up a reliable workforce. Um, uh, and then he and a small group of people he recruited went around and taught people, collective enterprises, how to build kilns. Uh, as Mr. Xu said, I taught people how to properly build cold fire kilns, and brazing kilns. I showed them how to stack the bricks and stoke the fires and control the amount of water. For my service, they paid me and the other workers that he employed 2 to 3 yuan a day and gave us cigarettes. But then over time, Mr. Xu became increasingly ambitious. He decided to scale his activities. He hired a Sunday engineer to help design more efficient kilns. A Sunday engineer is the term they use for someone who worked for like a state-owned enterprise during the week, and then on the weekends or the time off, he would work in the informal economy to generate a sideline income. And then he recruited large number of laborers from the countryside and then began contracting their work out to formal enterprises to build and production brigades to build these kilns. And he said, in working with the brigade leaders, everybody wants to leave their work unit and do contract work all year round. But since the work unit still had to meet their agricultural production quotas, it was decided, and here in collaboration with the production brigade leaders, that about half the men would do short-term contracts. The other time would work full-time at the kilns, and then afterwards we would all share the profits. And so from 1967 to 1969, Mr. Xu and his team built about 12 kilns a year, which produced about 700,000 tiles and 100,000 bricks. But what was really incredible about Mr. Xu was his ability to coordinate this network and keep it going and protect it from prosecution. So Mr. Xu maintained systems of tribute with officials and state-owned enterprise managers. He red-hatted through an SOE. Red hatting was this practice wherein a formal enterprise would provide the necessary documentation and licensing and contracts and things to an informal enterprise, allowing them to operate under their umbrella, put on their hat. And then the informal enterprise would do all of the work, and then they would remit a certain portion of the profits back to the formal enterprise. And he also bribed officials. He gave them lots of gifts. He took them out to banquets and the like. There's a really revealing quote from the case. Mr. Xu said, "I don't even smoke, but carrying cigarettes in my pocket was a must. Lion brand at a minimum. Every time I ran into those guys, i.e. local officials, I had to present them with cigarettes." Um, so by operating under the radar of the state, Mr. Xu and his team were able to carry out a massive amount of activity all across their province and operate for 2 years, generating a large amount of profits. But what was really interesting, even when they were caught, ultimately, they went largely unpunished. Mr. Xu was given a nominal fine of 400 RMB. He had made way more in profits than that from the activities. And all of the workers he employed and the production brigade leaders that he was collaborating with and the local officials that were on his dole, none of them ultimately got punished. So he was very, very successful in sheltering the entire network from prosecution. So now let me kind of wrap up. What was the aggregate impact of these informal intermediaries, these people that brokered capitalism in Maoist China? Well, ultimately, these informal intermediaries made markets. They created alternative markets where none officially existed. The socialists planned economy in its quest for imposing state control over different facets of everyday life had outlawed many forms of private exchange, but the demand didn't disappear. It simply went underground. These informal intermediaries, they facilitated productive exchange outside of state channels. They ultimately restored price signals, creating intersubjective bases for the valuation of goods that weren't supposed to be valued. For example, like ration certificates, they were supposed to theoretically have zero value, and yet, as we saw in one case, someone generated 23,000 RMB in profits from their sale. They're restoring price signals in the economy, and they enable the creative recombination of resources. These goods for which no markets are supposed to exist, that they're supposed to circulate through formal state-controlled channels, they're now being recirculated by the market and reallocated to different productive ends. These informal intermediaries also reconnected the economy. So a lot of early scholars who wrote about the Maoist economy, they talked about its atomization and fragmentation. People like Audrey Donathorne and Nicholas Lardy and so on and so forth. But what we find in these cases, and a deeper kind of study of the everyday economic practices in this period, is that the economy was being reconnected over time. So here I mapped out cases of these informal intermediaries that involve these informal intermediaries from just one county in China. And of these several hundred cases, I created edges where cases involved activities that traversed administrative boundaries. And here we can see that cases were in this one place in southern Jiangsu involved a very, very broad region that kind of radiated out from the point of origin, and that people were moving goods and labor and knowledge across administrative boundaries all the time, reconnecting these supposedly fragmented parts of the economy. And these informal intermediaries also enveloped state enterprises in their informal networks. This quote from the Hangzhou Office of Attack, the Dajitoji Dabao Bangongshi in 1974 stated, there's an active segment of class enemies who, together with scoundrels concealed within state institutions, are forming collusive relations between state and society. Together, they are privately establishing underground factories, underground shops, underground contract teams, underground transport teams, and underground clubs in order to obtain speculative profits. The critical point here is that the informal economy isn't something that's just operating in the shadows or at the periphery. It's operating in the interstices of the formal system itself, and it's connecting formal enterprise and formal markets in unanticipated ways. And ultimately, these informal brokers gain the support of many local officials. as one of my favorite quotes from the Central Committee in 1970 said, many local cadres operate with one eye open, one eye shut, ignoring the familiar activities of speculators and profiteers. They stroll over here and take a look over there, and when they see someone selling goods, they just let them go. Others have gone so far as to announce at production meetings, as long as you don't sell opium, anything goes. Again, the point here is that the informal entrepreneurs were ultimately winning the support of local government officials, at least in some places in China. Okay, let me conclude with this slide. So what does this work collectively say about the state of the economy and economic change during this period of time? Well, the dominant narrative holds basically that state market relations were largely non-existent, that state institutions were the universal mediator of transactions in this economy, that the role of private organizations was extremely limited and marginal. Scholars often cite the number of 个体户, like formally registered independent enterprises and stuff during this period, and you can see it almost drops to zero in most places. And that the nature of market transformation was state-led, and it was this gradual transition from plan to market. So you have people like, for example, Isabella Weber, who talks a lot about this kind of top-down adaptive transformation over time that really begins with Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up. But ultimately, I think we see something slightly different when we look at these cases of these people who were brokering capitalism in Maoist China. We find that state market relations, they were intertwined and mutually constructive, that informal markets existed within and were enabled by the formal structures. That private organization wasn't limited and marginal, rather it was ubiquitous, and it operated within the interstices of the formal economy. And that the nature of the market transformation in this period was hybrid and path dependent. It was shaped by both formal and informal forces. Okay, I will stop there and take some questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam. That's wonderful talk and really, really interesting. Okay, as I said, we have some time for questions now. So please, if you have any questions, submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out for Adam to reply to. Maybe I can get us started. I mean, I'm still somewhat fascinated by all these informal networks and informal actors, but I still want to know a bit more what the state actually thought about this. I mean, was there an understanding from sort of the upper echelons of the state that this was kind of even necessary for the economy to work, or for people to basically survive, to have these informal networks? And is that why, for instance, local officials kind of let it pass and let it exist, or was there any kind of drive at any point in time from the state to really completely extinguish these informal networks?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think first, during this period, what I experience is a sharp bifurcation in terms of discourses and practices. Discursively, everyone is saying we should, or it depends on which period we talk about, of course. In the early 1960s, in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, you do have a lot of moderate voices that are saying we need some degree of market activity. We need to allow the limited restoration of particularly rural markets to address these acute imbalances that were created through kind of planned mechanisms. But of course, over the course of the 1960s into the 1970s, these moderate voices are sort of drowned out. And then if you look in the documents, most of the assessments are, of course, very negative. But what is interesting is if you look at the internal reports of for example, the Gongshan Xincheng Guanliju in the State Administration for Industry and Commerce, in like the publications like the Gongshan Xincheng Tongbao, the circular of State Administration for Industry and Commerce, they're repeatedly emphasizing this its persistence and its ubiquity. So there's an acknowledgement that it's going on, it's taking place, it's very widespread. People aren't stamping it out effectively. But of course, there's this ceremonial adoption of the language of class struggle and the necessity to eliminate the, the kind of capitalist forces within the economy. But what people are doing in practice often deviates from that a lot. So I've interviewed, for example, Xie Gaohua, who was he was the former party secretary of Yiwu and Shuzhou. Yeah, and he was one of the first officials in 1974 to start allowing certain types of private market activity again. Particularly, he allowed local tangerine growers to transport their tangerines across administrative boundaries and sell them in urban marketplaces. And that's at this time that was Changtu Fanyue. It was long distance trade, which was encompassed under the category of speculation profiteering. So while he himself would have performed also to the language that was dominant in the discourse at the time, his actions were very, very different. So I think that's something that you really have to wrestle with all the time as a historian. You can't just believe what you read necessarily. You have to see what people were actually doing. But that's what these case files that's what it gives us a unique window into, because it's not just these ceremonial documents that are saying prescriptively what we need to do, but rather they're saying what actually happened in practice.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Um, okay, so we have our first questions. The first question comes from my colleague, Professor Billy So, and he says, thanks so much for the fascinating talk. Given the proletariat dictatorship nature of the Maoist criminal justice system, especially during the Cultural Revolution, how can a researcher assess the reliability of the so-called facts about crimes recorded in specific legal documents?
I mean, it's a great question because, again, these documents are highly performative. They are performative on multiple levels. On the one hand, the people that are authoring the case files, these are the local cadres, the market administrators who are writing these documents for their superiors in the state bureaucracy. On the other hand, if we look at things like the interrogation transcripts, the self-confessions, these are performative too. It's the people being prosecuted and what they're saying to perform to the market administrators. So everybody is engaging in discursive strategies and concealment tactics and hybridity to basically say one thing and act in another way. We find layers and layers and layers of this. So the documents have to be read very carefully, both along the grain to understand how these practices of prosecution were being carried out, what the logics were that were being implemented in the state bureaucratic administration, but also against the grain to see where the gaps are, the silences, what is absent and what is being actively kind of silenced. That being said, even though they're highly problematic sources in one dimension, they're also extraordinarily revealing in a way that higher level documents aren't. If you look at higher level reports, so these case files they're maximally raw sources. They offer very, very thick descriptions of the activities that they're describing. And a lot of these descriptions, they get scrubbed away in higher level reports. So we get all kinds of fascinating details that we would never see by looking to higher level documents. And then there's also certain mechanisms of control in place that prevent people from fabricating things too much. For example, the local market administrators, they couldn't over-report the amounts of activity, for example, that they were prosecuting, because they're having to remit the goods that they seize, the goods like the cash, the ration certificates, the items and things like that. They're having to remit that back to state agencies to go into state coffers. So they can't say that, oh, this speculator, he accrued 23,000 RMB in
speculative profits over the course of 18 months without being able to back that up, because then they have to take a substantial portion of whatever they report and then remit that. So they're held accountable in that way. So they're trustworthy along certain dimensions, but we have to adopt a healthy degree of skepticism as well when we engage with the documents.
Yeah, thanks. The next question comes from Matt Lowenstein, and he says, fantastic talk and fascinating work and very persuasive. Given the extent of markets in the Mao era, what, if anything, actually changed in reform and opening?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of things changed in terms. I mean, reform and opening was essential in terms of allowing these things to scale, to proliferate. So what I'm looking at, are sort of heavily biased sample. I'm looking mostly at Zhejiang and Jiangsu for this kind of book project. I'm seeing the proliferation of black market activity in these areas. I don't think it was ubiquitous necessarily. I think it was. Of course, every region in China had some degree of these types of activities that I'm describing. They had certain amount of these informal brokering going on, certain amount of alternative market creation processes. But it's much denser in some places than others. Reform and opening up ultimately enabled the practices that were ubiquitous in certain heavily commercialized places that had long histories and traditions of commerce and things like that, to then spread those practices at a much larger level. They also allowed things to scale. Like, for example, the labor broker that I mentioned, who's having to red hat under a state-owned enterprise. Red hatting is great. I mean, it allows you to get by and engage in certain amounts of activity, but ultimately there's still a massive amount of risk. It would be a lot easier if you could establish a formal enterprise, even if that formal enterprise, for example, had to be registered under the auspices of a collective, like a township village enterprise, for example, in the 1980s. So reform and opening up did change the dynamics about this. It changed the risk structure. It changed the degree. It changed the pace of capital accumulation in the private economy and the amounts, the size and scale of activity that we see going on. But as you alluded to, like, the foundations for all of this are being laid way before reform and opening up happens. Reform and opening up is formalizing a lot of activities that already had become ubiquitous and normalized on the ground, at least in certain parts of China.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, maybe I can first come in here, because I think one of the questions that I had is whether geographically, I know that the sample is kind of is Zhejiang, Jiangsu in particular, but I mean, can we see any kind of connection? Let's say a particular area has a lot of informal economy sort of activity before the reform and opening period, whether we can see then economic growth going up, or the reintroduction of market forces working particularly well after. Or I don't know whether that goes beyond what your data sort of can show you, but it would still be interesting to see whether there are connections like that.
It would be fascinating. This is like a thing that I would love to do, and has been tantalizing prospect for a number of years now. So the problem I ultimately face is, obviously constraints of data. And here, so I have a very, very robust data set. So the data set that I mentioned, 2,300 plus cases, that's the largest data set of its kind for Maoist China. I looked at cases from 2 counties, and I know exactly the number of case files that I have as a proportion of the total number of cases that were prosecuted, and their distribution across time. So we have a sense of the sample size, the missing cases, everything like that. So that's really good, robust data, but it's only 2 counties. Then I have another data set that I built where I look at the prosecution trends across the nation. Now, the problem is I get the total number for that data set. I get the total number of cases that were prosecuted, and I get the total number of individuals involved that were prosecuted. So like every case prosecutes on average like 1.7 people or something like that. then I get the total amount of goods and cash that are seized as valued by the state administration. The problem is, I don't know if those prosecutions are a reflection of the intensity of prosecution in a given place, or if they're a reflection of the extent of overall informal activity. So if a place prosecuted a lot of cases, is that because they were particularly that they were faithful in carrying out the commands of the center in engaging in these anti-capitalistic campaigns? Or does it mean that there's just so much illicit activity and they're only captured? I don't know what proportion of the informal economy these cases are prosecuting. And that's a really, really tricky puzzle to solve. So it's very difficult then to draw connections. So I can look at the total number of cases prosecuted at the county level, provincial level, across this period, and then draw correlations with regional economic development afterwards. But I don't 100%, I can't be 100% reliable that that's a reflection of the informal economy of that period, or if it's just a reflection of idiosyncratic prosecution trends.
Yeah, it makes sense. That's that's difficult with the data. That's true. The next question comes from Bill Kelson, and actually we have a second question that kind of goes into the same direction. So maybe I'll just read both of them. The other is from Zhang Zhen, so I'll probably read both of them because they go really into the comparative sort of question. I think we can take them together. So Bill's question is: would love to know how all this compares to black market trading with ration script in other planned economies of the era or in war economies generally. Any comparative reference that shed light on your cases? Cheers. And Zhang Zhen's question is, as we know, there were also black market behaviors and informal trades and commerce in Stalinist Russia, the Soviet Union. So compared to Maoist China with Stalinist Russia, what are the differences of the patterns of informal capitalism between these socialist states? So kind of similar questions, I think, here.
No, and it's wonderful questions. So I mean, the kinds of activities that I'm describing are universal. They're not necessarily particular to China. We see informal brokers of all sorts in both formal and in both planned economies and capitalist economies. We see this kind of activity across all contexts. What I think is really interesting about the Chinese case is, well, for one, China didn't have the same type of planned economy that Soviet Russia had. The mechanisms of central coordination weren't as elaborate. The Chinese economy was always a more kind of decentralized authoritarianism. It was more fragmented and locally and regionally kind of determined than in Russia. And this kind of like altered the dynamics a lot of the informal economy. One crucial difference that I find really interesting is, why if informal, this type of activity that I'm describing is ubiquitous in both the Soviet Union and China, why do we see them take fundamentally different developmental trajectories in their post-socialist transition? One answer that I keep coming back to, that I keep finding repeatedly in the cases, is this issue of local buy-in. So in the case of China, over time and in certain places, you have local officials siding with the local entrepreneurs, these informal brokers, but other types of entrepreneurs too. And this happens at multiple levels. It happens at the level of local cadres, like for example, village secretaries, party secretaries, and village leaders and production leaders and things. It also happens within the state bureaucracy itself. So I've done a lot of work looking at how these cases were actually prosecuted, not what the prosecuting official said, but actually looking at how they prosecuted in practice. How much did they actually punish cases? And what we see is discernible patterns in their prosecutorial strategies, that actually prosecutions were very measured and calculated over time, that these these market administrators, even though there's a whole broad host of activities that are included under the category of speculation and profiteering, even though they're supposed to be punished the same according to central government policy, they actually punish them very differently in practice. Activities that were more productive for the local economy, and we can go into how we define that and stuff like that, were punished much less severely than activities that were viewed as unproductive. So this gradual buy-in, I think, was a really critical thing that enabled the proliferation of informal economic activity, and it provided pathways for transition that weren't as available to Russia, to the USSR. At least what I've read about the USSR, the activities seem they're big scale. They have many of the same dynamics, but they didn't have quite the same level of support on the ground necessarily as what we're seeing in China.
All right, thank you. We have two questions left that are both by Daniel Ho, and I don't quite see exactly the direct connection, but anyways, I'm going to read them out. So the first question is whether there's anything that you can say about Deng Xiaoping's ending the Cultural Revolution, and the second question is about the number of deaths in the Cultural Revolution, whether you can say anything about that. I'm not sure whether I don't quite see the relevance, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so Andrew Walder has like great statistics on this about like the number of violent deaths in the Cultural Revolution. For my cases, what's really, and this was actually really shocking to me. So when I was reading these case files and first starting to create the data set that I used to do some of this analysis, I expected that a very high portion of the individuals being described here would have suffered very bad ends, that they would have been sent to labor camps, that they like 劳改劳教, or they would have been sent or possibly executed, something like that. What I found though, when I created the data set and looked at the outcomes as described in the cases, they're remarkably lenient, unexpectedly so, that the vast majority involve no form of extra monetary punishment. In other words, in the vast majority of cases, and we're talking something like 94% or something like that in the data set, people are just issued fines. People have their goods seized, they're issued with fines, and then that's it. That's the end of the prosecution. That's the end of the prosecution, at least as described in the case. I don't know if people went out and did some kind of extrajudicial kind of activity, vigilante justice or something. I don't know. But yeah, and that's really interesting in and of itself, that these activities aren't being punished in the way that we might imagine based upon our prior assumptions about the Cultural Revolution, about the violence of this period. In practice, these informal activities are being tolerated to a level that might seem unimaginable, prior to the deep reading of these materials.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. All right, we are pretty much on the dot. So yeah, the hour is already up. As usual, time flies too quickly. But what remains for me to do then, Adam, is to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about your research and to answering all our questions very, very patiently. I think it's really fascinating research and a fascinating data set that one doesn't come across easily. So I can appreciate how much work there was also in accumulating all these sources, and I think we are all looking forward to learning more. I mean, you've already published, of course, quite a lot, but we are looking forward to learning more about your research in the future. So thank you very much to you, and thank you to everyone for tuning in, particularly in Hong Kong at this late hour.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And anybody, if you have any more questions or just want to chat, feel free to send me an email, and I'd be happy to engage.
All right, thank you so very much to everyone. Thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Gaston.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. Thank you.